Okay, in this demonstration, I'm going to be showing how to do a simple Tai Chi movement. It's not the full form, which would take a long time to learn, but it's just going to be a few movements. Usually to start off, so this is for novice and beginners that are not used to or haven't done Tai Chi yet. It gets them used to doing the movements known in Tai Chi. So at the beginning, you usually start with your feet together. And what you are going to do is slightly bend your knees. Then you're going to step out. After you step out, you're going to raise your hands to about the height of your head, and then start bringing your arms back down to about your waist. After this, you're going to do what's known as holding the ball. You're going to step out, and then you're going to do a position known as roll back. You will also sit back as you're doing this. Once you go to the next move, which is known as press, you will lean forward. After press, then you will lean back again, and then push while also leaning forward once again. This move right here, which you can't see on the video, you will be rotating your left foot while pivoting on your heel. And this is known as the movement of single whip. At this movement, you will touch all your fingers together, and you will face the other direction in a 180 degrees, step out, and then push. And that will be the single whip motion. Now these movements are, it can be very difficult, especially when you put them all together, which I'll demonstrate them all together right now, because you're going to do them on both your dominant side and your non-dominant side. So if you were to put it all together, once you get to that done on the first side, you're just going to hold the ball again, and then you're going to start the motion again for rollback. You're going to press again, you're going to push, and then start the single whip formation. Then to end it, you're going to push on the other side again, and then you're finished. Now these movements can be very difficult, especially if you're doing it on your left and then your right side, or your right and then your left. And it depends on the person and the novice. If they're right hand dominant or left hand dominant, these movements can be difficult. Now in order to teach a novice how to do these movements better, it's easier to freeze the degrees of freedom within the body. That way they're able to learn the movements easier.
Okay, first let's define degrees of freedom. Degrees of freedom are really independent states of motor control movements. The degrees of freedom problem was identified by a Russian scientist, Bernstein, and what he found is that as independent states of movement were made at the same time, it became difficult to control those, especially through like neural processes. Now, in this example, I'm using degrees of freedom to show elbow flexion and elbow extension, and this would be an example of 1 degree of freedom. So, for instance here, as we see that the arms are straight here, this would be an elbow extension, and then as the elbows are bent here with the arrow showing that the palms are moving up, we can see that the elbow is in elbow or elbow flexion at this point. From elbow extension here to elbow flexion, this is 1 degree of freedom. However, let's look at the wrist, for example. As we notice here, in this photo right here, the wrist is in a pronation rotation or position. Notice that because the palms are down. Now as the palms are up towards the ceiling, we're in a supination position for the wrists or for the hands. This is interesting because that could technically be considered 1 degree of freedom. But if we also look at the wrist, we know that it can move medial, lateral, and also up and down, and it also can just rotate in many different ways. So the wrist actually has many different degrees of freedom, where the elbow likely has one, and if it can move the arms from side to side, which could technically be 2 degrees of freedom. Now, during the early stages of motor learning skills, cognitive processes play a very vital role. Now, natural movements usually do not have few independent states, so degrees of freedom involves much coordination. So if we look at the movements that I was making earlier in the video of the combined Tai Chi formation, where I was doing hold the ball, rolling back, pressing, and then pushing, and then also performing the single whip movement, then we notice that there are multiple degrees of freedom there. So we saw in the wrist example that I showed where there's multiple degrees of freedom. Imagine if you now add the upper body and the lower body movements, we have many degrees of freedom. Thus, coordination is really going to play a vital role. And because there's more coordination, that's going to involve more neural activity and more difficulty, especially if we haven't been experienced to that motor skill yet. Now, in an interesting study, these researchers compared professional piano players and non-musicians. And what they found is that piano players actually utilize less active neurons than non-musicians. This is interesting because it's basically telling us that novice individuals have to utilize much more active neurons to perform new motor skills. And this can be seen too whenever we look at beginners that are starting on a new motor task, and they could seem confused, or they're trying to figure out what to do next. Now, when we're looking at learning a motor skill, we can look at it in 3 different stages, and it's good to look at this so that we can identify where the beginner is if we're trying to teach them a new motor skill. So for instance, we have 3 stages. Stage 1 is the cognitive stage, and that's when the individual is determining actions and solving problems for the new motor task. In stage 2, and that stage 1 cognitive stage is what I was just talking about, where we see them struggling and they're trying to figure out what to do next, and they're reading all that feedback, and they're like trying to figure out what's a good way to perform that task. In stage 2, that's when they actually begin to start making adjustments, and they're trying to evaluate the effectiveness of all the different variables of the motor task in order to perform the best to perform it the best way. Now in stage 3, that's the autonomous stage, and that's when motor tasks are performed in a really automatic manner. And that's because the individual has performed many different trials and practice and gained much experience in this motor task. So if we look at it in a simpler version, we see that stage 1 is actually more like a beginner stage. Stage 2 is more like an intermediate stage where they're refining their motor skills. And then stage 3 is where someone becomes more experienced, and we could even consider them a professional at that point, because they're not even using they could not even be thinking about the motor skill. And that goes with the example earlier about the study of the piano players. In this stage 3, those professional piano players were likely at this stage 3 autonomous stage, because they didn't have to use as much active neurons in order to process that information. But that only comes with experience and increased trials and practice. So In the early stages of motor learning, an individual can reduce coordination issues by simply freezing degrees of freedom in movements. And then what they do later, once they continue to practice, they can then release or set free those degrees of freedom in movements where they initially froze them. Freezing the degrees of freedom can also enhance the performance in the movements on the non-dominant side of the body. So if we use the Tai Chi example I'll use here is the first position, or this first movement, which is known as holding the ball in Tai Chi. We see here that this is actually a photo that I took from the video where I'm actually making the movement, and you can see it's starting to go to where I extend the elbows out to elbow extension, and then the arms are in front of me, and then I'm starting to go back into the roll back position, and then start for the press, the push, and then the single whip. However, let's change the scenario as to just to make an example. Let's say that this is a beginner right here, and let's say that the left arm right here is the dominant side of this individual. So let's say that this left arm kept on coming on top. He kept on positioning on top, and then his right arm kept on positioning it on the bottom, the opposite of what it's supposed to be. Now, that individual might do that because the left side is his dominant side, and the right side is the non-dominant side. So this might be more natural for them. Now, in order to now that would be inefficient in something especially like a martial art like Tai Chi, because if he uses the wrong hand placement, then that opens them up for a strike from the opponent, and that obviously wouldn't be good, because now this martial artist right here wouldn't be able to defend themselves correctly. Now, if we want to teach them the movement correctly, what we can do is I labeled this red, and then I labeled this area green. And what this signifies is the red area is going to be where we freeze those degrees of freedom. So all the lower parts of the body are going to be we're going to freeze those, and then we're going to open up all the upper body movements. So in this example, we just have them stand still. And then what we can do is we can have him do elbow extension while also rotating his, let's say that this was his dominant side, we can tell him to place his palm into, or place his wrist into a supination position, and then his non-dominant arm or wrist into a pronation position. And then what we can do is then tell him to just simply rotate the elbows inwards towards his torso, and that would be the end movement. Now this would be a really good exercise, because now we're teaching him how to put all those movements together, and that's really all he needs to do in order to complete that or perform that movement on his dominant side. Now, once he learns that movement through doing this sequence many different trials, then we can unfreeze his lower body, have him do the stepping movements, and incorporate everything together. In another interesting study, researchers analyzed right-hand dominant participants performing rapid reaching movements to certain targets, and it was observed that after many repeated trials that all the participants showed similar time developments and accuracy to the target. The reason that this is interesting is because this is on rapid movements, but Tai Chi is involved in slow movements. And the great thing about this is this study right here shows that as participants continue on trials, accuracy becomes greater. So we know, and this is for the dominant and non-dominant arm arm movements, reaching movements, which is similar to the Tai Chi movements. So we know through practice and through repeated trials that you can effectively learn something accurately on your non-dominant side. But fortunately in Tai Chi, it's involves slow movements at first, and that will help facilitate motor learning.
For the first motion or the first movement, we'll be holding the ball, and in that movement you probably noticed that I bent my left knee whenever I went to my left side at the first. And that's one of the movements where both knees are bent and then the left knee bends while you're holding the ball. Now, this movement might be difficult to do it with both your lower extremities and then your upper extremities. So in order to enhance and facilitate that difference in movement, we can freeze the lower limb and only do the top portion, which is holding the ball. So if we're in just a regular position right here, which is just a very neutral position with our hands laying down to the side and then our knees slightly bent, your knees are always usually slightly bent in Tai Chi movements. All we're going to do is take the right hand, put it above about to where our chest area, and then the lower hand will just simply go below. Now if we do this, we can just rotate our elbows out and then bring them back in, and then we can do this movement many times. So if a novice is having trouble doing the stepping movement, which is bending, then stepping out in order to go to the roll back motion and then to press, we could simply freeze them in one position and don't move their legs, and then they can just practice on holding the ball. And if, for instance, let's say that they are good on the left side, but then whenever they come to the right side, they're not able to, or maybe they hold it backwards or the other way around where they're not supposed to, when they're supposed to have the other hand on top, then we can freeze that side and just have them practice. Instead of going right hand above to hold the ball, we can have them go left hand instead, which is the same movement, having the upper hand where the elbow rotates inwards towards the top of the chest, and then the lower, the opposite arm will rotate in and go towards the abdominal area near the belly button, and that's holding the ball. And then they can practice on doing the knee movement, and then you can simply have them step out and then start stepping back. And then you can also create a formation or a variation where they only practice on both sides. So starting with their dominant side and then their non-dominant side, you can just have them holding the ball on each side. If they're still having trouble trying to hold the ball, you could simply freeze their non-dominant arm, for instance, and you can just have them doing the movement just with the dominant arm. And you can also do this, then all you have to do is simply put it together. So they can do the first portion, and then they can do the second portion, just going to the lower abdominal area, and then they put it together.